Welcome to After School Democracy, the podcast that attempts to fill in the gaps you almost certainly missed in school about politics, economics, and history. Growing up, I was a huge DC Comics fan. Heroes fighting desperate battles and overcoming through courage, selflessness, and determination, but also through super science, luck, magic, and lots of money. The system wasn't perfect, especially in Gotham, but for the most part the law itself at least was fair and just. It was those who broke the law that were evil, and many were just too much of a super genius. Or there were crimes happening left and right where you could go on patrol and at random stop 20 crimes in a night that were just too much for the cops to take care of, or the bad guys got random superpowers and the government didn't have the power to stop them. I never questioned the justice of the courts except in the old Green Arrow Green Lantern comics and some Vertigo ones. Good always won, bad guys got their just desserts, and the law was just, but it was also fragile thanks to unforeseen circumstances. I kinda thought the same thing about reality. Yeah, there were still evil people, but the law was mostly just except for the occasional rich person who got off the hook. We had overcome most of the injustices now, and what we needed to do now was work on fixing ourselves so we could succeed in this imperfect but mostly fair, free market system we had. Crime would always be with us, but on average, the good would always defeat evil. I mean, just look at World War II. We beat the Nazis, nuff said. Ignore that the USSR did the majority of the heavy lifting there. Foreigners were poor because they didn't have freedom like we did, and had dictators we needed to liberate them from, and give them democracy so they could pull themselves up. Well, as I began to look beyond surface-level history, my view of pretty much everything about the world darkened dramatically. I began to learn about systemic racism that just evolved from slavery, each fight against it being 2 steps forward and 1.5 steps back, but in a way that would keep nice white people completely oblivious to the injustice. Blacks only ever got a handout in exchange for having something better taken away from them, while white people got lots of handouts in the form of government housing, cheap government loans, the GI Bill, public schools, the Homestead Act, welfare, and infrastructure subsidies that helped people who already had some wealth. Once minorities fought for it, suddenly it was vilified after the white people had been doing well and had gotten theirs, and suddenly if a black person got it, it was now a sign of moral decay and laziness on their part. This has continued on to this very day as black folks still are vaccinated at a fraction of the rate as white folks, often with vaccine drives specifically in poor neighborhoods, and comfortable white folks would hear about it online and go snatch up vaccines that were there specifically for people who couldn't get it elsewhere. Police violence, union busting, corporate theft of workers, colonialism, the high number of sexual assaults that's still very common, along with child molestation. These are things we were taught to look at as being mostly over, but they never ever went away. They just changed to be hidden enough out of sight, out of mind, to the nice privileged class, and the secret about reality that it was impolite to discuss, especially around the naive folk who were still innocent. That along with 80s cartoons, and we thought evil was easy to spot, and sometimes people were just evil, but it was most of reality that was fair and just. Mind you, Trump was really easy to spot as an 80s villain, and much of the nation still didn't catch that. As someone on Twitter put it, Trump is literally every villain where the hero is a dog. Which is ironic because one of the first things Trump and Betsy DeVos did in office was remove all listings of known puppy mills from the government websites. I guess if they had a twirling mustache and maybe one of those fake antique-looking bombs, the boomers would have seen this. Injustice happened, but it wasn't that often, especially here in the good old US of A, where we swallowed our cup of nationalism daily. The more you study, the more you see a repeat pattern of any radical reform bouncing back to evil, but now conforming to the new reality. This isn't DC's Earth 1, where heroes in the end always win. This is much closer to another Earth in the multiverse, DC's Earth 3. For those of you not in the know, in the original Silver Age canon, Earth 1 was where all the Silver Age characters lived, these being the heroes of the 60s and 70s. The Flash, using the right vibrational frequency, discovered Earth 2, where all the Golden Age heroes lived that fought in World War II. But as the comics went on, they discovered other Earths, including one for the Fawcett universe, where Shazam lived, and the Charlton comics, where the Question and Blue Beetle lived. But the worst one they discovered was Earth 3. This is one where the laws of justice ran backwards. Evil always won. This Earth, instead of the Justice League, had the Crime Syndicate. Instead of Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, The Flash, and Green Lantern, they instead had Ultraman, Owlman, Superwoman, Johnny Quick, and Power Ring. Each one of these members were sociopathic, malicious, arrogant, petty, and just plain evil. On this Earth, Alexander Luthor was fighting a constantly losing battle for justice. The Crime Syndicate were bored and discovered Earth 1 and thought it would be good for conquest. Turns out the Justice League defeated them because good always wins on Earth 1. Later on, the worlds collapsed into one Earth during the Crisis on Infinite Earths. Later in the 2000s, they revived the multiverse, and Earth 3 became Earth 2 made of antimatter. In it, there was a replay of the original version, except after beating the Crime Syndicate, the JLA returned to Earth 3, or Earth 2 in this case, and forcefully established rule of law, democracy, and cracked down on corruption. However, this went poorly because evil always wins in this universe, and all of their good intentions collapsed, and they had to flee Earth 3 as they were beaten badly. However, it was enough to keep the Crime Syndicate at bay, knowing that trying to invade another positive universe Earth, they would be beaten badly because evil only wins on their Earth. And seriously, when you look at reality and history for all it is, you feel like Alexander Luthor, being the small minority trying to fight against an unstoppable crime syndicate. There is a reason why the Illuminati is such a compelling conspiracy theory. There are shady organizations behind the scenes, all with their own nefarious schemes for their own benefit, ensuring all victories for good are temporary and all reversals are out of sight, out of mind, in new ways that just sound crazy until there's enough evidence to convince enough people that the injustice is really happening. These shady secret cabals, however, aren't the Illuminati, they're a patchwork of the rich with similar interests. Always the rich, and it's a very loose association. Slavery was defeated in the South, but President Johnson, who was petty as hell and had no issues with slavery but just felt slighted by slavers looking down on him, gave all their land back if they came to him and kowtowed to him. The former enslaved people lost their 40 acres and a mule in one fell swoop. The rich, using their understanding of commoner psychology, used donation money that was supposed to be used to help Confederate soldiers, because they didn't get any from the federal government because they were traitors, to write propaganda to tell of an idealistic utopia antebellum, including Gone with the Wind and the Confederate Catechism, also founding the Daughters of the Confederacy, who pushed altered history books in schools of the Civil War that was a blatant lie. The lost cause myth and the states' rights BS convinced enough non-wealthy Southerners to hate the federal government instead of the former slavers. These poor folk, who had fought and died so these rich folk could keep slaves, got cheap labor by renting the slaves, but in the end got hurt by slavery long-term as their labor and wages were depressed by slavery. Again, they believed the propaganda of the former slavers and hated the federal government and black folks and voted in rigged elections on both sides, and President Hayes, who actually lost, agreed to pull the troops out of the South if they let him be president, and immediately Jim Crow, prison labor created by rigged juries, voter repression, and the white supremacist coup of Wilmington, North Carolina won out. Black folks with no land or education and restricted movement by Jim Crow had to work their former masters' lands as sharecroppers, not legally slaves and often treated somewhat worse because they were no longer property. And of course, when black people did too well, they either destroyed them like Black Wall Street or classified them as ghettos and moved everybody out to poorer areas. The evil came back, and it wasn't until nearly 100 years later that enough lynchings, an increase in media like radio and TV, and increased access to printing allowed brave reporters to the South, at the risk of their lives, to expose all of these injustices in the rawest form. They got us the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and the FBI finally started cracking down a bit more on the KKK, which prior to this movement, J. Edgar Hoover had spent more money on suppressing civil rights groups as communists than he did cracking down on the mafia. And then once these laws passed, they changed things up. They created the war on drugs to bust black folks much higher than white folks, and we went from 1/5 the population in prison of the USSR post-Stalin before Nixon to 5 times that of the USSR by the end of Reagan's presidency, creating a prison industrial complex and putting black folks in prison at disproportionate rates with minimum mandatory sentencing. Crack getting much higher sentencing than cocaine used heavily by rich white people, and cops using torture up until the 1980s and being taught to use psychological torture until 2017 to get forced confessions, and with underfunded public defenders, most black folks could at best get a plea deal and serve some time, even if they were 100% innocent at the say-so of the cops, given giving the prison industrial complex more and more basically unpaid labor, as well as powerful votes for white people as an altered form of the Three-Fifths Compromise, as prisons were all put in white areas even though the prisoners themselves couldn't vote. Also, they couldn't vote afterwards, once they were out of prison, and getting an actual job after that was really, really hard. We kept being told by black folks about this, and the police brutality was real, and it sounded just too crazy and too cartoon villainy to be true until social media and cameras in every phone made it too hard to disbelieve, especially after the murder of George Floyd, and unless you only went to sites of for-profit news outlets created to keep the status quo and push culture war created by fake outrage and fake news to distract from all the injustice actually happening so they could live in their own little Earth 1 world where justice was real while we were living closer to Earth 3. And this is just systemic racism and how slavery never really went away because it was in the small collective of rich people's best interest to keep and modify this institution to make more money off of, hurting us all in the process without our knowledge. This is true of everything in America: police violence, minority rights, unjust wars for profit, union busting, corporate theft and abuse of workers, colonialism, the high numbers of sexual assault that's still very common, along with child molestation, the planet destruction for profit. All these things would at some point, since the founding, rise up and people would decide that it was wrong, and then the people with the interest to maintain it would just keep it hidden from the people, looping back to evil always winning until new technology changed information spread. I could have literally spent the same amount of time going over each one of these examples with the same level of detailed shadiness and time on it, but I just decided to go with how slavery never went away, it just evolved, because it's still so poorly understood. That said, as Obama said, there was a way higher population of people who were not black who marched for Black Lives Matter than did for MLK or any other time before. There are more waking up and discovering that union busting is an active, manipulating activity full of direct lies and information. The Russian troll farm tactics of 2016 were crafted and perfected by giant corporations, especially the oil industry for the past decade prior, and our social media companies wanted their money, so they were more than happy to allow it, which made it super easy for the Russians. There were always a handful of Alexander Luthors out there fighting back, trying to wake up their fellow citizens, and over the years, as we were all more informed thanks to the internet, even if we were informed without all the context and nuance needed, we are still more aware and are beginning to join the fight with our own goateed version of the Legion of Doom in greater numbers than ever before. In fact, I stopped reading comics back in 2005 because the plot got too cheap, in my opinion, and there were constant reboots of the universe, and the comics just cost way too much. But I read online that Earth 3 did end up overthrowing the crime syndicate, but they destroyed the planet on their way out to try and take over Earth 1. And that sounds about right if we aren't careful, as they're doing everything they can to destroy our planet just as we become a collective giant awakening from our slumber, all the while working on escaping with delusions of grandeur to move to Mars and other planets, leaving ours a smoldering wreck, just taking enough of us with them to do their dirty work and rule over us. The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. As King said, but as we have learned, that is magical thinking we often tell ourselves to keep ourselves from giving up hope. What it can also do is make us rest on our laurels, thinking that if we just wait long enough, the good guys will always win. That's in no way necessarily true. We were given the propaganda by Earth 3 villains that we live on Earth 1, and we believe it, which is why they always win in the end, just in a different, more secretive or normalized form. When you see our world as Earth 3 and accept it without hyperbole, everything makes a lot more sense, and it gives serious urgency to Gandhi's words of be the change you wish to see in the world. Cause no one else sure as hell is going to do it for you, and there will be no benevolent Bruce Wayne to come and save us. And even if some rich people do have all the best intentions, their money did not come from ethical places, and they will be so disconnected from the rest of us that they will often do what they think is good, and they think will fix things even though they don't actually work, because their actively evil or complacent counterparts are actively ensuring it won't work. They will also be unchecked in pretty much everything they do, because as Jeffrey Epstein showed us, there is no real justice for people with over $10 million. We are the only ones who can fix this. We are the Alexander Luthors of the world if we care enough, and we will always be painted as the villain until we aren't, and the real monster is unmasked. We just have to continue the never-ending fight for truth, justice, and the ideals of the American way, embodied only in the writings of Thomas Paine and the Statue of Liberty, but never guaranteed and long delayed to all, unless it was convenient for the wealthy to give us some of those rights, but only as a special class, so they could keep profiting off of the lower classes they created. Will we get there? Who knows, but with change happening faster in my lifetime than ever before, and more people becoming politically active than ever before, maybe, just maybe, we have a real chance before the crime syndicate destroys the planet on their way out. By the way, I pulled together 3 other videos I did on superheroes and put their links in the bottom bar. So thank you so much for joining me on my podcast. I'm sure there was nothing controversial about this, and everyone will happily get along in the comments section, which you can do on the YouTube version of this video, or my Facebook page, After School Democracy. Link in the show notes. Just a reminder that I'm Anubis2814 on YouTube, and I have over 500 videos on different topics that I've made over the past 10 years. Please subscribe, and if your podcast site has the option, give me a like or review. If you think what I have to say informed you, consider supporting my Patreon. I'll be doing this podcast weekly and try to get it out on the same day, so I hope to see you here next week, ready to be filled with new ideas. Take care. This channel is helped tremendously by the generous supporters on Patreon. A big thank you to the wonderful Joe Taylor, Elias Garcia Guevara, and Ogrel for their support at the $10 a month Wapawet level. Please consider donating to my work if you can, and thank you all for listening.